Good morning and welcome to our annual Learning and Teaching Conference. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Neil Juster, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Senior Vice Principal, and Neil will officially open the conference. Neil.
Thank you, Frank. Well, welcome everybody. It's really a genuine pleasure for me to be able to introduce and open this conference this morning. As it says in the information, I think this is the 9th Annual Learning and Teaching Conference. And it's really great, inspiring to see how the conference has grown over the last 9 years. And it's now, we think, the biggest internal event that we organise, and certainly the biggest one we do on an annual basis. Now, the first year of this conference came to pass following the launch of a new university strategy, obviously 9 years ago, building on excellence. A strategy which featured as its very first item, its first key line, teaching and learning. And it saw the beginnings of, I think, a tremendously positive change in the way that we've gone about learning and teaching at the university over the last few years. And we now recognise and celebrate teaching in earnest. Now, from those very promising beginnings in learning and teaching, the conference has grown now to over 300 delegates registered for today, so much so that we're actually having trouble finding spaces that we can actually run the conference in, and I'll return to that in a little bit later. And we've also got over 50 distinguished colleagues from outside the university, both contributing and taking part and listening today at this conference. Now, I mentioned that the first year of this conference followed the launch of a new strategy, and in that sense this year is not so very different. As many of you from inside the university will know, shortly after last year's conference we launched the successor to the successor, or the grandchild if you'd like, of the Building on Excellence strategy, called Inspiring People, Changing the World. And I thought I might just take a few minutes to outline some of the things in that strategy and what it means to teaching and learning at the University of Glasgow. I'll make reference to the three main pillars of the university and the three main pillars in that strategy: our people, our place, and our purpose. So let's talk about the most important asset first, our people. Inspiring People sets out our stall to ensure that our teaching staff are properly supported with the vital work that they do, including providing new CPD opportunities to support their professional development, ensuring that administrative support for teaching is appropriately resourced across the university, and most of all, ensuring that staff who have an ambition to enhance the learning experience of our students will always have the backing, time and resources they need to do so. But more than that, our new strategy renews our commitment to making sure that teaching is rewarded and respected accordingly. We're hard at work reforming our PDR, recruitment and promotion processes for the forthcoming rounds to ensure that our academics who are delivering world-class teaching have the same opportunity for advancement and promotion and progression as our world-changing researchers. What's more, for the first time next year, the PDR process will consider an individual's contribution to the team of their local unit, enabling managers to more formally recognise those staff who go above and beyond the call of duty to drive excellent teaching within their area, laying the groundwork for Glasgow to become the destination of choice for excellent teachers worldwide, and to achieve our vision of a first-class teaching within a world-class university. The second element of our strategy, place. As of yesterday, and those of you who've picked up the local papers, in fact some national papers this morning, will see that yesterday we formally took ownership of the Western Infirmary, a major milestone in our 10-year plan that will see £1 billion invested in the future of our campus and our university. And central to the plans for our state will be the construction of a new hub that will bring together a redeveloped Boyd Orr building and a brand new development on the adjacent car park to form a new world-class flagship facility for learning and teaching in Glasgow. Over £80 million will be spent on the new hub, a no expenses spared statement of intent that will put excellence in learning and teaching at the centre and heart of our strategy for years to come. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Frank and other teams. Frank's leading the design or the internal working groups that are working with the architects to make sure the Learning and Teaching Hub is absolutely fit for purpose when it opens in a couple of years' time. The new hub will provide over 1,100 learning spaces for students in a variety of independent and collaborative configurations, easing the space pressures we've seen across our campus over the past 5 years. There'll also be lab space for e-assessment, an increasingly important part of formative and summative assessment at Glasgow, and social space for our student clubs and societies to come together, as well as opening up learning beyond formal lectures and labs. What's more, there'll be a brand new 500-seat auditorium that will form the centrepiece of the hub, a lecture theatre that can be split into two 250 facilities, and a facility that will enable us to bring global voices and influencers into students' learning on a whole new scale. Outside of teaching time, it will, of course, serve a second purpose as an international conference centre without equal in the city of Glasgow. And given the way this conference continues to grow, I would probably assume that in 2019 we will be running the conference in that facility, as it will be the perfect venue for future learning and teaching conferences, both physically and, of course, philosophically. And finally, let's talk a little bit about the third strand of our strategy, our purpose. When we first started the process of going around the university and speaking to the staff about the way ahead for us over the next 5 years, the message in relation to learning and teaching was quite clear. We needed to make the university a more responsive and flexible place for students to learn. Part of that, of course, is about the environment we create around our students. But more than that, I think there's a specific challenge for all of us to think about the future of how we engage with students in their learning. And so the subject of today's conference, active student participation in learning and assessment, is especially fitting. One of the avenues for thinking about this that the strategy particularly highlighted was what we call connected learning, the use of new technologies to enhance the way we teach and the way students learn. And it's clear from today's programme that the influence of technology is increasingly making itself felt within learning and teaching. During your workshops, you'll have the opportunity to hear and discuss about how technology has been used to, amongst other things, support student orientation and transition, empowering peer review, facilitating massive open and distance learning, reflect upon and record their learning, enabling learning anywhere and any time through mobile devices, engaging students and teachers in conversations both inside and outside of the classroom, and even enable students to take control as the co-creators of their curriculum and course materials. And we're taking the benefits of technology-enhanced learning and teaching very seriously at an organisational level as well. Setting aside dedicated seed funding for the development of MOOCs and blended online learning, factoring IT to provision into the Learning and Teaching Hub and the General Estates strategy and ambitions, and continuing to invest in the platforms and infrastructure that underlie it all to ensure that the only ancient aspect of our university is its charter. So that's a little bit about learning and teaching and what it means for our people, our place, and our purpose. Perhaps now I should give the final word to a statement at the heart of the strategy, our mission as a university, to bring inspiring people together. Days like today allow us to do that, to set aside our everyday duties and obligations, to come together and reflect on our practice as professional educators, and these events are only too rare. But I believe it is vital that we make the time to do it if we're to achieve our vision of a world-class, world-changing university. And we should seize these opportunities wherever and whenever we can. So please throw yourselves in today. Forget the technology buzzing in your pockets, turn off your mobile phones, and focus on the technology in your classroom, and question and interrogate everything you see with the same spirit of active learning and stimulating inquiry that we aim to inspire in our students. Enjoy today, and again, welcome to the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. Well, I don't get the exciting things to do, I have to say. I get to do what's called, or collectively called, housekeeping. So a few announcements first of all. So fire safety. We are not expecting a fire alarm. So if the fire alarm does sound, it would do so by a continuous electronic sounder. And if that should happen at any time during the day while we're assembled here in the Butte Hall, then please exit via the fire exits at the front and rear of this room. So that's those two ends there. Go down the main staircase and make your way through the archways to the assembly point at the south flagpole overlooking Kelvin Grove Park, which is out in that direction. Evacuation and assembly point information for all the other venues will be announced by the session chairs at the start of each session. Second thing is that you all have a personalized program. So when you signed up for the conference, you identified the sessions that you want to go to, and actually in the program, those are listed for you. So hopefully nobody will forget what they signed up to. Personally, I did, but that's another thing entirely. We've also got a Twitter feed running, so if you like what you see, or even if you don't like what you see, then please use the Twitter feed. And the hashtag for that is inside your conference folder. Over the last few years, we've been doing this, and some of the social media around the conference has been absolutely terrific. So please, if you are an active tweeter, if that's the terminology, then please do so at this event. I'm also delighted to say that the conference this year is sponsored by Cengage Learning and by Wiley, and both of these organizations have stands just outside the Melville room, in front of the Senate room, and so please take a bit of time to go and see what these organizations have to offer. Both are heavily involved in supporting learning and teaching globally, and as I say, there are quite interesting things they've got at their stalls for you to look at. Neil already mentioned the Learning and Teaching Hub, and the design of that hub is now well advanced, and we've begun trialing internal room configurations. And this year, you've got the opportunity to explore different types of room layout and technology that we're thinking about for the hub. And so manufacturers of this equipment have come along. They're located in the Senate room, and from lunchtime onwards, you'll have the opportunity to try out these configurations. I should say that we're also changing a number of rooms on campus over the summer for teaching next year to trial new configurations. And many of you will have seen the advert that we put out in Campus e-News about asking for academics who are interested in teaching in these spaces. We're going to have a program of evaluation as well. And also in the Senate room today, we'll have posters about the Learning and Teaching Hub to give you more insight into what we're doing in terms of the design there. And obviously, any feedback you have would be gratefully received on that. The other thing that will be in the Senate room are the poster presentations that were submitted to the conference. So actually, the Senate room is a great place to be, to go and have a look at those materials generally. In terms of the venues we're using for the conference this year, we've tried to make sure that the signposting is absolutely clear and that you won't get lost. But if you have any doubts at all, please go to the registration desk and ask, and the staff there will be more than delighted to help you to get to where you want to get to. And also, as in previous years, we very much welcome feedback on the conference. We've used the feedback that we've had from previous events to help shape what we do and evolve the conference year on year. And I think that as the years have gone on, we seem to be getting the format right, but obviously we do want to know what you think about things, and we'd be very pleased to get that feedback. I would draw your attention to within the booklet and at the final page of the abstract booklet, we have listed the staff who've been awarded principal or senior fellowship through the new Recognising Excellence in Teaching scheme that we piloted last year. That scheme has been rolled out further this year and will continue to be a major feature of the university going forward. And personally, I'd like to extend my congratulations to the individuals that are listed at the back of the booklet there. And going back to the conference, again, this year, we will have a Best Presentation Award, and we'll be presenting that at the close of the event. So for those who are presenting, no pressure, but we are expecting some wonderful things today. I couldn't possibly go on without recognizing that the event this year is tinged with some sadness. Just over a week ago, we lost one of our great colleagues after a long illness. Paddy O'Donnell taught in this university for 46 years. To students, he was simply known as the legend, not because he'd been teaching for so long, and he did actually, in one particular case, teach 3 generations of the same family. But he was known as a legend because he was a truly gifted teacher. To his colleagues, he was a tower of strength, leading in the organization of and innovation in teaching. I think Paddy, for me, helps to define something in my mind that we often struggle with, and that is to define teaching excellence. I would suggest that teaching excellence was personified in Paddy. I don't think Paddy was somebody who would have appreciated a room like this observing a silence for him. So let's applaud and celebrate a great colleague. Returning now to the conference, one of the great benefits of this conference is that it helps you to shape your thinking and challenge your practice. It does more than that. Often the conversations that take place in and around the conference are what actually create the spark that allows us to innovate in what we do generally in the institution. It's a unique opportunity for networking, so please take advantage of that. This year, as Neil said, we've got a record number of delegates, more than 300, and it is our highest number ever, and I'm delighted that once again we have a large number of colleagues attending from other institutions. So whether you've come here from Galway or Ulster or London or Leeds or Newcastle or North Carolina or Lincoln, or even closer at hand, you are extremely welcome here, and please share your experience with us and hopefully take something away from seeing what we do. Every year, I find myself saying what an exciting time it is for the university, and of course this year is no exception. We've already heard about the Learning and Teaching Hub. We're doing some really exciting things with MOOCs. We've funded a program around development of blended and online learning, and there's more things to follow in the years ahead. It really is a great time to be here at the University of Glasgow. But most importantly for me is the quality of the everyday work that our staff do, and I think that's what we should celebrate the most. I've got the great privilege of seeing a lot of that when I do subject reviews. And the feedback that comes from students, the appreciation that they have for what our staff do is absolutely tremendous. And for anyone who attended the Student Teaching Awards recently, you would have seen that in spades. So that's a great testament to the commitment of the staff in this university, and I'm extremely proud of that. We've got a lot to celebrate, we've got a lot to look forward to, and this event is an important part of our journey. It highlights the breadth, the quality, and the innovative nature of what we do, and it provides a wonderful platform for sharing best practice. I do hope you have a great day. Thank you for listening. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Professor Peter Felten from Ellen University is going to talk to us today around an intriguingly titled presentation, Mind the Gap, Pedagogical Intention, Student Perceptions and the Power of Partnerships. Peter has an impressive pedigree. He's Assistant Provost for Teaching and Learning, Executive Director for the Centre for Engaged Learning, and Professor of History at Ellen University. His publication record includes books on the undergraduate experience, transforming students and engaging students as partners in learning and teaching. He's President-elect of the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning and co-editor of the International Journal for Academic Development. I think this is going to be good, but no pressure. Peter, over to you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I live in the American South, and there's a tradition there of call and response. So let's try this again. Good morning. Thank you, that's much better. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here. It's an exciting time, it sounds like, to be at Glasgow. One thing I wasn't planning on saying, but because Neil and Frank mentioned this, about space. Learning spaces are really important. And if you've got a huge learning hub coming, I would encourage everybody to go to the Senate room and check it out and make suggestions, because the spaces we have enable certain kinds of teaching and learning and constrain certain kinds of teaching and learning. And once you build a gigantic building, it stays forever, especially at a place like this. Someone yesterday in the Aspen session said, really universities should be rebuilt every 15 or so years from the ground up because we know new things. So here's a chance for you to do some of that work. So welcome for that. Before I get into my talk, just apologies for my strange language and my unusual accent. I'm also going to be citing mostly sources from across the Atlantic. I know there's much going on over here, but I think you know that, and I'm trying to bring new things into that conversation. And I want to start, just to say this too, I'm going to talk some, you're going to talk a little, we're going to have some questions and discussion, a little bit of practical information, and some practical examples that are meant to span disciplines and span areas you teach. You won't see exactly your stuff here. You won't see the technology you use. You won't see your discipline. But you'll see, I hope, things that you can connect to your work. Right? But to begin, I want to start with a story from a really great book that was published 1.5 years ago in the United States called Minds on Fire by historian Mark Carnes. Carnes teaches at Columbia University and Barnard College, which is the women's college with this, affiliated with Columbia. And Carnes starts his book, well, just for the technology people in here, the subtitle of this book is How Role Immersion Games Transform College. Okay, so technology people, it's not really about technology, but it's right there with you. But Mark's broad point in this book is that what we aspire to as academic staff is to have our students' minds on fire, right? For them to be so engaged in what they're learning in my history class or your physics class or whatever it is, they can't help but think about it, learn, be curious, etc. And Mark had won a number of teaching awards at his university. He was quite proud of his teaching, and he begins this book, though, by talking about a semester he taught that was really quite dreadful. He said it was maybe the worst semester he'd had of teaching. He thought he was dull. He thought his students were disengaged. He was really quite depressed, and he got at the end of the term, he got the teaching evaluations that students filled out. And he was surprised to see how positive they were. And he thought this didn't make sense. He recognized that when he taught well and the students were engaged, of course the evaluation should be positive, but when it was terrible, what was going on? And so he said, after reflecting on this, he was walking across his campus, and he bumped into a couple students from this class. And he said, so tell me about the class, because I didn't think it went that well. And one of the students said to him, according to Mark, all classes are sort of boring. Yours was less boring than most. So Mark's aspiration in this case was to have his students' minds on fire, and his students' aspiration was to be in a space that was less boring than most of their other classes, right? So there is some sort of gap sometimes between what we want and what students experience or what students perceive. In the United States, there's some quite troubling data that's pretty clear now about this undergraduate experience. One bit I want to show you to start with is from our National Survey of Student Engagement, which is different than yours, but related, right? And one of the things this survey shows, and it has consistently for the last 10 years, is that as you get further into your undergraduate career, you study less. That is not what we aspire to in our students. And actually, interview data based on this say that many American students come into university expecting to work hard and find they don't have to work as hard as they expected. And so they don't, right? That's troubling, right? We have our intentions of minds on fire. We have practices that seem to lead in my country for students to study a little less and less each semester. There's a book that came out, I don't know if it made much of a splash over here, it made a huge impression in the United States, called Academically Adrift. And it was based on a 24-institution study in the United States, longitudinal study, looking at students for 6 years, from when they began through 2 years out. Academically Adrift looks, this version of it looks just at the first 2 years of college. But all sorts of different institutions, from the most selective private institutions to open access community colleges in the United States. The conclusion, and looking at all sorts of different measures, the conclusion the authors drew in 2011 was that American higher education is characterized by limited or no learning for many students and persistent or growing inequalities over time. I don't know if a comparable study has been done in Scotland or in the UK or where you teach, but it's really quite striking to look in the face of the data and say, wow, what we aspire to may not be happening, or may not be happening for all of our students. And one more thing to make you think you never want to study in the United States, and then we'll get to the optimistic part, is there's pretty clear research, and the phrase in the UK I think is widening participation. There's pretty clear research in the United States that the results here are different based on a number of personal characteristics you have. So this is data about socioeconomic status. I'll explain this to you so you can be properly depressed. So the bottom axis is a very common admissions test that students take in the United States, the SAT. If you're on this side, you're scoring quite high. If you're on this side, actually the bottom score would be way over here. On this side, you're scoring below average, but not much, okay? On the vertical axis is your chance of earning a 4-year college degree by the age of 24. Does that make sense? Now, the solid line at the top is if you're in the top quartile of income in the United States, if your family is. And the bottom dotted line is if you're in the bottom quartile of income in the United States. And so what that suggests is if you're one of the wealthiest people, the wealthiest quarter of people in the United States, essentially no matter how badly you're prepared for university, you're more likely to graduate from university than if you are among the best prepared students from the bottom quartile. And the gap tracks, it's about 40% benefit for coming from a wealthy family in the United States. Does that make sense? Do you think there's comparable, or is there comparable data in the United States, or in the UK and in Scotland, perhaps? It's troubling, at least where I come from. And I'm on a project right now that's working to try to ameliorate this in a number of different ways. There's a brand new set of research coming out that's digging into this data. It's by Elaine Seymour, who's actually from England. She's done a very large study with colleagues across the United States about why students in the United States drop out of STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, math, right? This study's not yet published, but I saw her present on it actually last week. She says the vast majority of the reason students drop out of these fields comes down to two things. It's the way we teach and the beliefs students bring with them about how learning works. Okay? That's what shapes their decisions whether to stay in STEM fields, to stay in college, according to this very large study. So what do we do about this? My point here, to play with this silly metaphor that Americans associate with the UK of minding the gap, is that there's a gap between our intentions and what students experience, and there's also gaps within our universities of how different students of different backgrounds experience our universities. And so the question is, what do we do? What can we as a group collectively do? What can we do as individuals to attend to that gap? Now, there's going to be particular things anyone can do, right, depending on your discipline and whatnot. But I think there's at least the research in the States suggests, and some of this is echoed, I know, by research in the UK, some of this suggests there's at least 3 things we should pay particular attention to. And they may surprise you, maybe not. A student's sense of belonging at university. I'll explain that in a minute. The relationships students form at university with faculty, with academic staff, but with peers in particular are particularly powerful. And then active student participation. And I think if you attend to those 3 things, the research is pretty solid in the United States, that those 3 things will ameliorate, they'll reduce a lot of those gaps. They'll enable more students to have the experience we aspire to, and more students, regardless of background, to have the best possible university experience. What I want to do is unpack each of these just really briefly to make sure we're all on the same page, and then give you 4 examples of practices that you could think about that would get towards these. Make sense? With me so far? Okay. So sense of belonging. I know there was a big study here called What Works that did quite a lot of work on sense of belonging, and there's a nice piece by Thomas, 2012, that defines belonging in an interesting way, because I'm a historian. I didn't study education originally. I didn't study psychology, and when I hear sense of belonging, my first reaction was that's something, to make, let's all give students hugs and make them feel good about themselves. In the US, there's a joke that every elementary school student gets a trophy for everything she does, right? Because we're so proud. This isn't really about self-esteem, though. That a sense of belonging has to do with, it's an academic sense of belonging. I belong at Glasgow University. It's a social sense of belonging. I fit in here. And there's a meaning-making sense of this. What I'm doing here belongs to my life, right? To where I'm going. So thinking about belonging. Now let me give you an example. And there's Terrell Strayhorn in the United States is the name to know about belonging research there. That's his definition. If you're not familiar with belonging, let me give you just a quick bit of research, a story from some research from the University of Southern California. A faculty member there did a large study, 5,000 students, looking at male students, comparing white male students to African-American male students, college students, university students, about how they received feedback and what sense of it they made of that feedback, right? And so in these controlled situations, it's a really impressive study. He ensured they did similar sorts of work. He was sorting students. They gave them a similar task, sorted them by the quality of their work, and the feedback the white male students and the African-American male students got was identical if their work was essentially the same. How students responded to that feedback, though, was shaped very strongly by their sense of belonging at the university. If the student believed he belonged at the university, of course I'm at the university. My parents went to the University of Glasgow. I was taught by the legend. My grandparents were taught by the legend. Of course I'm here. Students get critical feedback. Those students get critical feedback. They tend to say one of 2 things. Either the teacher is an SOB, or I need to work harder. And this is a wake-up call, right? If the student does not believe he belongs at the university, if he has questions about this, I'm the first in my family, I'm not sure I can do this, I don't see a lot of people around who look like me, what he does with that same feedback is say, perhaps this is proof I don't belong here. This is evidence that I shouldn't be here, right? And the research around belonging is that we can convey belonging by having clear and high standards, and then by explaining to students why this particular work doesn't meet those standards, right? But assuming that all students have the same sense of belonging, at least in the United States, is just not true. And it shapes everything that they experience at the university. So that's one factor to think about, and I'll give you some examples of how to cultivate this. A second is relationships. There's a really interesting study called How College Works. In the United States, we use college and university interchangeably. New study came out in 2014, Chambliss and Tuckus, How College Works. It's a 10-year study of one college. It's called Hamilton College in New York State, where they looked at the paths of every single student through Hamilton in that 10-year period. And from the ones in the very first cohort, they followed them all the way into life 9 years after college. And what they find is the single best predictor of student success at university and after university is the relationships they form at university. As this quote suggests, the relationships shape what they do, peer relationships and faculty relationships, and it shapes their motivation. The really interesting and somewhat frightening part of this study is they say for a student looking at their alumni in this study, for a student to have a positive experience at university and to have positive outcomes after university, they need at least one strong relationship with academic staff and at least 2 strong peer relations. That's it. Yet many students go through Hamilton and don't have both of those. Right? And so they conclude after this quote by saying what we need to do at universities is to build pathways into relationships, to use spaces, to use programs, to use our pedagogies to develop relationships among students and between staff and faculty, the staff and students, right? So that's 2 factors. The third is active student participation, which you all know a lot about because that's the theme of this conference, right? And people like Kathy and Colin and others have done great work across the UK on this. This is a new book in the United States, relatively new book in the United States, about helping students learn how to be students. And I think it makes a great point that when we focus only on our teaching, we're leaving out students as agents in their own learning. And so thinking about how do we develop agency among our students, where they see this as their work, not something that we do to them, but something they do with us. Okay. So, we're just about to the part where you have to talk, but not yet. So, what I want to do now, I've established, I hope, a sort of somewhat clear framework about 3 things that are extra important when thinking about enhancing student learning and getting their outcomes to match our aspirations. I want to illustrate for you how you could do this with 4 different practices. They're going to come from different disciplines. They're pretty new examples, so some of them, even if you're very active in this field, you may not see some of it. And give you a chance to think about how this might relate to your own teaching, your own learning, your own program. First one of these is called peer instruction in the United States. Technologists talk about clickers, audience response systems, systems like poll everywhere and things like this. What I want to do is I want to show you an example. How many of you teach with peer instruction or some version of this? There's a few. Are many of you familiar with it? Some. Okay, I'm going to show you a version, ask you to do it, and then twist it a little bit in a way that research is revealing makes it even stronger. Okay, so peer instruction is a fairly simple technique. It works really well in large classes where you periodically interrupt a lecture and you ask a conceptual multiple choice question. The question should be really hard. The question shouldn't be about solving a problem. It should be about understanding something. I'll give you an example of this in a minute. And you challenge students to think on their own and then to interact with a peer to make sense of this. And then you immediately give yourself and students feedback on how they did, and then you shape your teaching based on this, and they can shape their learning based on what they see. Sounds sort of abstract. So I'm going to make you do it, and then I'm going to show you an even better way to do it. than the standard way. So what I'm going to do is you're going to pretend for a moment, God help you, that I'm teaching you physics. And I've been doing a lecture about momentum. Physicists in the room, please apologize, but I'm stealing this question from Eric Mazur at Harvard, so, who's a physics professor. So it's okay. A historian is not going to try to teach you momentum. And what you're going to do is I'll read you the question. I've just taught you everything you need to know about momentum. I'm going to read you the question. You're going to very quickly write down the correct answer. Then you're going to turn to your neighbor. In groups of 2 is ideal. And talk to her or him for just 1 minute about what the correct answer is. If you both have the same answer, make sure you know why you're right. Because I'm going to call on someone in this large room to explain the answer to everyone. Right? That could be you. If you have different answers, figure out why you're right and they're wrong, or they're right and you're wrong, or you're both wrong. Right? Does this make sense? And then, so you're going to vote. Well, you're going to write down your answer. You're going to talk. You're going to write down your new answer. Okay, if we had clickers, we'd do this differently, but here we go. So this is a momentum question based on my experience late last night in Glasgow. So you're driving down a curve on a narrow one-way street at 40 kilometers an hour. You notice a car just like yours coming straight at you. You realize you only have 2 options, hitting the other car head-on or hitting the giant stone wall because it's Glasgow. You just have a split second to decide what to do based on what I've taught you about momentum. So what do? Do you hit the other car? Do you hit the wall? Doesn't matter. Check your notes on momentum. So very quickly, write down the correct answer. This isn't really a physics class. It's okay. Just write down the correct answer. Now turn to your neighbor and talk to them for a minute. Remember, if you're both on the same page, why are you right? If not, who's right? Okay, this isn't really a college physics class, so I'm going to make it just a little shorter. When you do classic peer instruction, you can do the entire thing in about 5 minutes, right? So if you have an hour-long course and you do this once or twice, you're not giving up too much content. One thing before we get into what the correct answer is, did you notice what happened in the room? Went from dead silent to lots of talking, actually lots of laughing, lots of smiling, some head holding, and whatnot. So I'm not going to ask you what your individual answer is, but I would like a show of hands. How many people changed their answer from when they were voted originally to after peers? Just raise your hand. Not so many. You're stubborn, perhaps. I also didn't give you very much time to do the groups. So I'd like to do this with a show of hands. It works better with clickers or poll everywhere or something like this because you can't just look at what Frank does and agree with him. You have to have your own autonomous answer. But so how many people by show of hands think the correct answer is hit the other car? Okay, not so many of you. Take note. How many people think hit the wall is the correct answer? The majority. How many people think it doesn't matter? There we go. How many people are checking your notes? Yeah, there we go. Yes, indeed. Yeah, don't drive with them. Now, according to Eric Mazur at Harvard, since we're studying purely momentum here, the correct answer is there's no difference. I'm a historian, not a physicist, so don't ask me to explain that, but you can look it up online. He's got a project about peer instruction where this question and others appear. The interesting thing here is now, notice, if I'm teaching momentum, I know I've just done a pretty lousy job of teaching you the basics of momentum, and perhaps I should rewind, and I know something about what you're misunderstanding, especially if we debrief this, right? You also know something about your own understanding, right? Some of you, I saw this after the, right? So some of you can feel good about what you know. In fact, there's evidence that doing this kind of exercise is increasing your sense of belonging, right? If you get it right, it's like, maybe I do belong in a physics course. And if you don't get it right, it still can increase your sense of belonging because you look around and go, wow, everybody else is as lost as I am. So you feel a little less alone in this. And notice what it does to relationships too, right? Now you have a colleague who you could talk to, and there's really strong research in the United States going back to Yuri Treisman in calculus in the 70s, that students who study in groups learn more than students who don't. Now, so this technique has become fairly popular in the United States. There's a twist on it that's really powerful towards our ends that we're talking about here today that I want to illustrate for you. And it's to turn this into a quiz, where what you do is over the course of a couple weeks, you do 1 or 2 peer instruction questions every lecture. And this adds up to a quiz grade. But instead of simply answering what's the correct answer, you answer what is the correct answer and how confident are you that you're correct on a 3-point scale. And after the peer discussion, if you are highly confident and correct, you get 6 points, right? Medium confident and correct, 5 points. Low confident correct, 4. The trick is low confident and incorrect, 3 points. In other words, if you don't know the answer, you're not being punished too much. If you're highly confident but incorrect, you get 1 point. Does this make sense? The research on this is magic, but let me illustrate just what happens here. So here's an example from Dennis Jacobs, who taught chemistry at Notre Dame for many, many years. So we have a solution. He would do an experiment up here to demonstrate it's a large general chemistry course. This solution does not conduct electricity. This one's a poor conductor. I'm going to pour them together, and what's going to happen? And what you have to do, I'm not going to make you do this. You're going to have to enter your correct answer, what you think is correct, and what your confidence is, right? Then you have to talk to your peer, and then you do the same thing again. That second thing, your peer discussion, is how you get your points. In Dennis's course, this is what happens. On the left side is the individual scores, okay? So the correct answer, you all knew this, is dark, right? So on the individual side, on the left side, high is blue. So high confidence is blue, medium confidence is maroon, pink, low confidence is yellow. So individually, most of Dennis' students did not know what the right answer is, and the vast majority were not confident of what the right answer is. After 2 minutes of discussion with peers, no intervention from him at all, they changed on this question to most of them being correct, and the majority of the class being confident that they were correct. There's absolutely fascinating research coming out in a couple different science fields in the United States that by regularly prompting students about their confidence, you actually build confidence in students. You retain students who historically drop out of general chemistry classes. Dennis's course, he developed this at Notre Dame University, which is a highly selective university in the United States. When he began without peer instruction, about 20% of his students did not complete his general chemistry course. And when he looked at that, even though their academic backgrounds were identical, female students and African American students were far less likely to complete than white male students. After this, the dropout rate went to 3%. And what was happening is that students who came into his course without a strong sense of belonging and confidence were reminded every day when they were right that they should be confident and they do belong, or reminded when they were wrong that they were in good company in being wrong. And so after about 3 weeks of doing this twice a class, 3 times a week, Dennis says the students become remarkably good at aligning their confidence with their correctness. And if you know you're right, you feel good about this. If you know you're wrong and you know you're wrong, you know how to behave, right? So this simple intervention increases belongingness really substantially. 5 minutes a lecture. Interesting. It's one example. A second example is a brand new project. The article I'm going to cite is going to be published next month. It's based out of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, but it's a 7-institution study. And the project is called TILT. It's based out of Nevada, Las Vegas, so they have to have some sort of gambling metaphor. So it's TILT, Transparency in Learning and Teaching. And the premise is that if we actually engage staff and students in thinking together about how students learn and why staff structure learning experiences the way they do, students will learn more, right? If we're transparent in what we do. And the framework is really simple. It's actually so simple, you probably will say, I think I've seen this before. And they say what you need to do is be transparent about the purpose of an assignment. Why are you having students do something? The tasks you're going to ask them to do. What exactly do they need to do? And the criteria for which you'll measure excellence and how they can evaluate their own work as they're doing this. Does that make sense? So in this study that I'm talking about that's coming out next month, worked with about 300 faculty and 7,000 students in their classes. And what they did is a transparent exercise trying to increase the transparency of 2 assignments per course. So not a huge intervention. And what they found is students' retention increased, belonging increased, community increased, and learning increased from doing this. And the way you do this, basically, is you sit with a few students and you ask them to talk to you about these questions. So looking at this assignment that I've developed for you, what do you think you're going to learn from doing this assignment? And the key follow-up, do you care? Right? Then asking students to list and explain what it is they think they need to do to complete this assignment. And then asking them to reflect on how confident they feel they can do this and how they would judge their own quality of work. Does this make sense? You do this with 2 or 3 students in a draft of an assignment you're developing or of a test. And you listen very carefully to what they say, and you make judgments on how to respond or not. Doing that in this 7,000 student study with 2 assignments in a course leads to statistically significant improved student learning outcomes. It's pretty magic. Okay, so that's 2 examples. You can do it yourself, too, if you try to read as a novice, or you give this to a peer and say, I know you're not a historian. Read this and think about this if you were a first-year student. So if you're too scared of your students to talk to them, you could talk to colleagues. A third example of how you might do this is 2-stage exams. This research comes out of physics education. Carl Wyman, some of you physicists would know, he won the Nobel Prize around the year 2000 in physics and then put all his money and a lot of his efforts into physics education. And they've done some really fascinating work on 2-stage exams. Does anybody here use 2-stage exams or know what I'm talking about with 2-stage exams? 1 or 2? Not so much. It's really frightening when you think about the idea at first, but it's simple and the results are powerful. So if you have a 90-minute class meeting, this is from Wyman's article, and you're going to give a 90-minute exam, and you typically would give that as an individual student exam. They sit there and sweat for 90 minutes and then turn in their exam. What you do is you break the period up, and for 55 minutes you have students do an individual exam just like you would ordinarily. You have a 5-minute passing period where they're turning in their exams and getting into pre-established groups. And then you give them a 30-minute exam that they complete one of, right? So all in the same class session. They're doing 2 exams. Wyman recommends 85% of the grade or so comes from the individual work, 15% from the group work. You don't want to create incentives for students not to study and just ride along on the best student in the group. You also don't want to create incentives for students not to care about the groups, right? Because the group is where a lot of powerful learning happens. And then the group exams typically have some of the same questions as the individual exams and some extensions of them. What I want to do, I'll show you a quick exam question from Carl Wyman, and I'll show you the results of doing this from a class at the University of Rhode Island. So this is a physics question. It's an intro physics question. You don't need to read it in any great detail to know that on the individual exam, you get the question about you're trying to pull your kid's sister in the snow. It's an acceleration in mass sort of question. And so in the individual part, the left-hand part of this, This is basically calculations. Can you do the kinds of calculations you need to do to demonstrate you understand the basics of acceleration and friction and whatnot? When you get in your group, you're not redoing those calculations. You're extending that by representing that graphically, right? So you have to talk about what the correct answer is, why it's the correct answer, and what it would mean and what it looks like. Make sense? The data on this is really stunning. Wyman's article has a lot of this. This is not from that article. It's from a different experiment that's not yet published at the University of Rhode Island. There's 450 students in this class, and this professor in Intro to Human Anatomy gave 15 questions that were the same to individuals and to groups. Individual performance is the dark line by question. Group performance is the light line. What you'll see is the groups always did better. And often in cases, there are a number of questions, like question number 2, where about 2/3 of the students got the right answer individually, and almost everyone got the right answer after the group. What you're doing by changing your exams into this way is you're enhancing student learning, because students walk out of the exam not just feeling frustrated or inspired by their own performance, but having actually learned from their peers. There's research that suggests you're enhancing their sense of belonging, and again, you're reinforcing their relationships, and you're making them active in the work, right? So this is a small change to student learning that leads to more learning outcomes and greater retention. One last example, and then I'm going to close up and we can have questions and discussion about all of this, is thinking about, and this is broader, I've tried to give you very concrete, specific, doable examples. This last one is harder, and it's about really making this student experience in your program integrative. There's been quite a lot of writing in the last decade or so about integrative learning. An influential piece in the US is from the Carnegie Foundation, Mary Huber and Pat Hutchings, talking about integrative learning actually building habits of mind that prepare students for their careers, but also for their civic life. And I don't know about the UK. Right now, we need more people in the United States who are prepared to live sane civic lives, because we don't have so many of them, it seems. Let me give you one example of a fascinating integrative program. It's at Ohio University in mechanical engineering. And it's clever in a number of different ways. It's called Designing to Make a Difference. It's a year-long capstone for fourth-year undergraduates in mechanical engineering. And what they do is they work in teams with community partners on real issues the community partners have that can be solved by applying mechanical engineering principles and practices, right? So these students become consultants to a community agency. There's an example here about removing holes from microgreens for organic farming. Who knew this was an issue, but it turns out it is, right? What's really interesting about this is, so for the fourth-year students, you see how that's integrative, right? Because they're putting together everything they've learned through their 4 years of studying mechanical engineering. What I think is genius about this Ohio University example is in their Intro to Mechanical Engineering course, a large first-year course, they bring these fourth-year student teams in regularly and break the large course up into small units who become consultants to the fourth years. So the fourth-year students are pitching their ideas for solutions, and the first-year students are responding. The fourth-year students are showing the first years the presentations they're planning to give to the community partners, and the first-year students are responding as first draft, right? So what's happening is they're not counting on the first-year students to be experts in mechanical engineering. They're counting them to be good novices who can give feedback about where the fourth years are clear, where they're not, how they're using principles. But at the same time, they're teaching the first years, this is what you're going to do in 3 years. This is what you're capable of. And so they're building teams, and it's fascinating because if you go study this program, you go observe this program, they meet outside of the assigned times, first years, fourth years, to prepare their work, the fourth year's work. It becomes a larger team. And so they're making the entire program an integrative experience. in mechanical engineering, of all things. So there's fascinating ways to do this. And what these practices all aim to do, again, is get students in relationship, especially with peers, in meaningful academic relationships with peers. It's fantastic when they can have a relationship with staff, but at a huge university like yours, or even at a smaller one like mine, there just aren't enough faculty to mentor one-on-one every student. So strong, purposeful peer relationships with all students having a sense of belonging and the students feeling a sense of agency in what they're doing, right? Two closing thoughts, right? One thought is that these things are mutually reinforcing, right? If students have a sense of active participation, have space to actively engage, of course they're going to feel like they belong. And they're going to put themselves in relationship. They're going to be in relationships. And if you're in relationships, you feel like you belong, right? So these are mutually reinforcing things. The last point I want to make before inviting questions, well, two last points, actually. One, I forgot about, this one, I'm sorry, which is just a number of studies Kathy and I and others have done about students experiencing this sort of thing. And it's really powerful to listen to student voices in this. And I know looking at the conference program, you'll have chances all through the day to hear students and hear student voices. But I just wanted to bring a couple student voices into this mix. That when we engage students, they end up asking questions like Chris, the student at the bottom, who said, wham, was such an odd question. What were my responsibilities for my own learning, right? We want, as faculty, to use an American term, I want to teach students who are active student participants in their own learning, who see it as their job to learn and my job to help them. So we've got to create spaces and opportunities for them to belong, them to be in relationship. Just to close for me, I want to go back to the gap that I was talking about early about different student experiences at our university. And in the United States, differences between, for example, low-income students and high-income students, ethnic minority students, and majority students. And I think one of the things working on these does is it reminds us, and it reminds all of our students, about the purposes, to use a word Neil used, beginning. The purpose of the university isn't simply career preparation. It's significantly career preparation, but it's more than that. It's exercising our freedom in such a way as to make a difference in the world for more than just ourselves. So if we can have our university, if you can have the University of Glasgow doing that, with all your students, imagine the multiplying power that has for Glasgow, for Scotland, and for the world. Thank you very much.
So we have some time for questions. So questions for Peter.
And there are microphones, which you should use, please. Yeah, right here.
We got our question wrong. Our momentum question.
You got your momentum question wrong.
Yes, and we got it wrong.
Uh-huh.
And we were wondering, so we thought that because the wall was stationary and the car was moving, we decided that we might try and hit the wall. And we also thought that there isn't another person. So if we collided with the wall, there would just be us. So, and then I looked at the graph and we got a 1. So we were just wondering, why?
Why? So you have to talk to a physicist about conservation of momentum and all this. But I want to raise up your point about if you hit the wall, then there's only one person in an accident, right? And so maybe there's an ethical implication of that question, which is very interesting. Now, the nasty American in me says, I don't drive the wrong way down the road. Well, actually, I do here. So if someone should hit the wall, maybe they should hit the wall. But the other car. No, so it's an interesting way to raise different kinds of questions, to extend your point a little bit without having to explain momentum, which I'm not very good at. I have a number of colleagues in history and in literature who use this kind of thing and ask students to justify an argument and give them a set of options. Which of these is the strongest justification for that analysis or something like this? There's not a correct answer in that. But what you want is students explaining why their answer is strong and seeding conversation about what should be the best analysis. Does that make sense? So you can see, without having to explain physics, how that prompts your mind to be on fire, right? Great. Talk to a physicist to get momentum right. Other questions or comments? Thank you.
Hello. I just wanted to ask about the 90-minute exam, where you get students to do, I think it's 55 minutes on their own, and then form groups, and then do the rest as a group exam. Is that credit bearing? You know, I'm just thinking I could have a fight of students all wanting to sit with the best students so that they get the best answers for their, out with the fact that if you want to test the individual side of it, I'm not sure whether, just not sure if I would be comfortable with that as a credit bearing exam.
Okay. I would encourage you to look at Wyman's research in physics, and it's mostly from the University of British Columbia and the University of Colorado, which I think are somewhat peer institutions to Glasgow. So you get similar kinds of students and similar whatnot. What they recommend is that you form student study groups right from the start of the course. And that some professors will want us to form them based on some sort of entering criteria. Some will say, look at the group sitting near you. You are now a study group, right? And you let it go. The remarkable thing is that the gains are very common across groups.
I mean, I could see using it as practice, you know, if you were doing revision. Because I know that I don't have such a formal system, but I might well get groups to brainstorm a question together and do a mind map and that kind of thing.
Well, I think that's a great idea, and I think that might be a really interesting way for you to try this, right? So don't put the stakes of a real exam on it, put the stakes of a practice exam on it. You see how students respond to it. You see what the work looks like. You see what the differential in performance is, and you say, is this something that's worthwhile? But the research from Wyman and colleagues says that doing two-stage exams actually leads to more individual student learning. And their goal is individual student learning.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Back here, yes.
Yeah, I had a similar question really, which is, you know, when you were talking about group learning, and one of the things that we often, I'm not from this university, I'm from Liverpool Hope, but one of the things we often do in our course is try and get students to share their work, whether it's a draft of an essay or to discuss questions. And often it's quite hard to get them to do that. They're very reluctant to share their work or share their ideas because they're worried about getting them stolen. Right. People stealing their ideas, or they're worried about, like you say, perhaps the stronger students feeling that they're carrying the weaker students. And obviously these are concerns that everyone has. So I wondered what, you know, the research you've talked about would say about those kind of concerns that students often have, I think.
Sure. And these can be legitimate concerns. Different campuses have different cultures around competition, and different disciplines do too. There's a really clever approach to try to navigate that from the University of Kansas, a professor named Dan Bernstein, who teaches large 300-400 student introduction to psychology courses. And he has his students write essays, short essays, as part of their exams. He's got a lot of TAs, and he values writing quite a bit. But what his technique is he brings in, he tells his students that he always changes the essay questions semester to semester, but that about a week before the first exam, he has his students already pre-divided into small study pods, and he gets them into their pods in lecture, and each pod gets 2 essays unmarked that were written by students last term. Unmarked, no names. And the rubric, and the question, and the rubric his TAs used to evaluate that essay, right? And then he has all the groups score both essays, and then as a class of 400, they talk about the scoring of this, right? And what happens is, and he does this before each of the first 2 exams, if it doesn't go well after the first 3 exams, but typically just the first 2, and students get better at using that rubric and understanding it and applying it to written work. And what he says to students after this exercise, it takes about 25 minutes of class time, is you now know how to evaluate written work. You could evaluate your own. You're in a study group. You could evaluate your peers, right? and do this. Dan's research shows that student essays get better when he does this, right? But an interesting part of this is he's not having them evaluate their own work, each other's work, and it's not a question where if you give away the right answer, the lazy kid benefits. Does that make sense? So by putting it on other student work, there's some degree of benefit. But yeah, because you don't want to create an incentive for students to not engage. And students often don't know what good introductory work looks like in a field. So showing them some of this. I have adapted Dan's technique in my own history courses, and what I do is I give students 3 essays, a pretty good essay, an okay essay, and a not very good essay, and I have them score them in class. They tend to give them all Fs. It's fantastic. So I get to say I'm much nicer as a grader than they are. But they understand things because they say things like your essay should have a thesis, and none of these have a thesis. And I say, yes, they should. And we do better. Does that make some sense as a technique? It's not quite as well researched as the other stuff, but it's Dan and his colleague, Andrea Greenhoot, have an article in 2016 in a journal called Teaching and Learning Inquiry about this topic.
Let's take 2 more questions, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Great.
Could I ask about the relationships?
Yeah.
You mentioned a minimum of 2 students and 1 faculty.
Yeah.
What sort of relationship with the faculty are you thinking of? I mean, one can imagine final year project supervisor
Right.
building a strong relation with a student, but that's quite late.
Right. The Hamilton study, and Hamilton is a much smaller school than Glasgow, or than Elon, where I am. The Hamilton study says it's a relationship with a faculty member who you can have questions that extend, meaningful conversations that extend beyond an individual course, right? So questions about what do I want to do to connect this work to my career? What do I want to do after university? How does all the work connect? So it can happen in 4th year. It doesn't have to be a 4-year relationship. What they suggest in the study is to build what they say is pathways into relationships so that students don't have to stumble into a faculty member's office to find this, but they're actually guided by structures in a university program, in a major, to get into those relationships. But 1 is enough, according to them. I think, I don't know.
You've already partly done what I was going to ask you to do, which is all of your examples were from the sciences.
Yes.
But you're an historian.
Yep.
And I'm an historian.
Yep.
So I wonder if you could give another example of the kind of activities, classroom activities you were talking about, but the one that an historian or somebody else from an arts background might use to engage students.
Sure, and I would love to use more history examples. Scientists, at least in the States, have a lot more money to study education than historians, and so historians scrape all their pennies together to go to Glasgow to go to an archive, and we don't study this stuff as much. A really simple and powerful example of doing this comes out of the arts and is based on critique, right? So in artist critique, what you do is you have some student work here, or an artist's work, and you look at it together and you talk about it. So a simple way to do this in a history course, in any sort of writing course with heavy writing, is, so in my own course, before the first exam, before each paper, I ask students to email me about a week before the exam, email me a draft of their thesis statement, right? And they get credit for simply emailing it to me. What I do is I take a few examples of those without names, and I put them on slides, and I bring them into class. And I say, class, here's an example of a thesis statement. Would someone read it out loud? I don't care who, someone reads it. And then as a class, we critique it. And what they say is what I would have ended up saying one-on-one to them, or even more, writing on their papers after they'd turn them in, which is, you need to make an argument. It needs to be a clear argument. You need to be able to support that argument with evidence, and it should be interesting. Right? They say that. We put another one up. Oh, that one's a little better. Why is it better? Oh, it's more specific. It's more clear. We do 2 or 3 of those, and I say to my students, I welcome all of you to come to my office, and I'll talk individually with you about your thesis statement. But it's a small, simple way for them, and you can do it in pairs too, put one up, talk about it in pairs. How is this as a thesis statement? And go from there. Does that make sense? As a simple way to have them do disciplinary work, get feedback on it, formative feedback on it, without me having to grade them all outside of class. Their essays are better for doing this. Okay, I'm going to be around all day. I know we've got sessions starting in about 10 minutes, so thank you all very much.
I guess we could have kept that question and answer session going for some time, but we are at coffee break. The next session starts at 10:40, so please be at your designated room on time. But for now, let's thank Peter for a very thought-provoking presentation and discussion session.